So have you heard? COVID-19 is soon going to be over, economies are going to bounce back, and all will be hunky-dory, except, of course, for the short-term inflation and the fact that in America, the jobs recovery really has slowed down, and there's still more than 8 million people who had a job before the pandemic, and they still don't have one now. So if the recovery doesn't happen automatically, let's just imagine that that's the case, what has to be done? America sounded like they might have had it right, but now there's many arguing that, in fact, the reason for the job slowdown in the recovery has been because cash handouts have been too generous, so people haven't seen the need to go back to work. Can you win on this? So what is the most sensible way of guiding economies out of the COVID crisis, assuming, of course, the virus itself goes away? That's this week on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, if you read some of the reports from august bodies like the IMF, notice the hint of sarcasm in my voice there, we really are going to come out of the economic downturn from COVID-19 surprisingly quickly. The IMF expects UK GDP growth in 2021 to equal 5.1%, in the US 6.4%, France 5.8%, Canada 5%, Australia 4.5%. They're less because, of course, they didn't suffer quite the same economic hit as the rest of the world. So, Steve, it's not as simple as that, is it, though? That because a lot of these forecasts are based on us getting vaccinated. Pardon me. There we are. There's a burp. So simple, Steve. It's not as simple as that, is it? Really? Because a lot of these forecasts are based on we get vaccinated, we go back to work, and we pick up where we left off. But as we were saying last week, we're picking up where we left off with a lot of businesses in much higher debt. But I suspect the business. That is going to be sector by sector, isn't it? There's going to be some sectors where businesses have managed to muddle through without acquiring much debt, and then there's others like airlines, for example, who've had to take on debt just to survive.
It's going to be a very patchy, sector-by-sector experience rather than a broad revival or a broad downturn. But certainly I think there's going to be more willingness to spend by household. I can quite go along with the idea that households are going to want to get out there and spend and party and celebrate being free of COVID, it looks like people celebrated being free of the Spanish flu back in the 1920s. But at the same time, they haven't got the level of savings people think they've got because households are carrying a far higher level of debt now than they were per head compared to GDP back in the 1920s. It's like trying to have it's if the Spanish flu occurred in 1928, not 1918. And that's a big difference. And for that reason, I think the capacity of the household sector to borrow, to spend, just isn't there. Whereas the corporate sector, even less. So we won't see a credit-driven boom of any sort, but there might be a behavioural one in response to the miserableness of the downturn itself. So I can see reason for saying a rebound this time that I didn't think were there back in the 2008 crisis, and they turned out not to be there. But this time there could be a rebound, but it's going to be attenuated by the unwillingness of people to go into more debt.
But businesses have been incredibly resilient, haven't they? What surprises me, I'm looking at figures from December only because they're the latest ones that we can get available from the Office of National Statistics in the UK.
You actually found data there, did you?
Yeah, there's a few numbers in there.
Must be a mistake.
Only 1.5% of businesses had permanently ceased trading as a result of COVID-19 or since COVID-19 had started. Airlines seem to be surviving despite all they've faced. We've got an accommodation business. 1.5 accommodation and food businesses, that is, have permanently ceased trading, despite the fact that they have had to be closed for so much of the last year. So there's enormous resilience in the face of such adversity. So they've taken on debt. That's been a large part of it. And there's been government grants to try and carry them through. So I guess that's all helped.
It has all helped. I was banging the drum about the need for massive levels of government assistance during the crisis back in February, March, because of last year, 2020, because without it, you would have had a massive failure. This is one classic case where the private sector could not provide its own cash flow. So you had to have government money creation coming in to fill the void. And even though there was far too much caution about that compared to what there should have been, there was enough to keep corporations from folding and people from going bankrupt on a massive scale. So it certainly, policy helped this time round, though it probably wasn't as high as it should have been, but thank God it was there.
Yeah. Well, surprisingly, it was there. I mean, because there has been in that month or two, there was a massive reevaluation about the role of governments and government spending and, chucking out a few old textbooks in the process.
Yeah, not enough of them, unfortunately.
But you've got to give some credit to the governments that have done this, haven't you? I mean,
this is what happens all the time. What pisses me off so much about economics is that when a crisis hits, before the crisis occurred, pariahs like me get ignored, and who's this idiot called Minsky anyway? And then the crisis hits. Holy shit! We're not going to let capitalism fail on our watch. They throw money, as they've got the capacity to do at all times. They throw it like crazy at the financial system to keep it from folding. And then on the other side, they go back to the same mentality they had that led to the crisis in the first place, where they ignore these issues. So,
and there's a danger that
pardon
could
me,
happen.
I'm not going to be waving a flag and cheering at the troops of the International Monetary Fund, I'm afraid.
All right, so how do we get out of this then? What should we be doing? Because if we've got this big concern that things are going to move slowly because of this business debt that has been built up, the US approach obviously has been that it's not over yet, and more fiscal stimulus is going to need to drive reflation. Do we need to? Have they got the right idea? Do we need to do more of the same? Because there is the concern, isn't there, that, well, some of those, for example, checks into people's bank accounts are going to find their way into the stock market, or worse, into cryptocurrencies and create bubbles which are going to, lead to the next downfall.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a fair bit of money turning up in the cryptocurrency world on that front, and also the stock market. That's true. And like particularly, I mean, I haven't even thought about that side of things because I work from home all the time anyway. But if you have somebody who's been working in the city and now confined to quarters back at home, what they're saving on transportation might well be turning up in cryptocurrency purchases. So there could well be a feedback from that into the level of speculative valuation we're seeing of assets like the stock market and cryptocurrencies.
But it's not just the money you've saved on your train fare in the United States. It's those checks which are landing in your bank account from the government as well. So you're potentially better off because of that too. So it's just the question about whether you're saying, well, okay, we need to increase spending. If it's not going to happen naturally, then we need to give people money. If businesses need to loan to try and meet the demand that we're trying to create, then maybe we need to give them money too. I mean, do you approach both ends to try and boost the economy? Because there's a danger that if you don't do that, then people will go, well, okay, it's great, but we haven't got very much money to spend. And businesses go, well, the subdued demand, we're carrying so much debt, we're really not going to, we're not really going to grow too much. And the economy just sort of vegetates for a decade.
Well, this is why, back when the crisis, when the COVID thing began back in February, March of last year, I was saying we need a modern debt jubilee because there was a policy I put forward after the financial crisis in 2008 that I thought had absolutely zero case of ever happening. So I simply I wrote it up very briefly on my blog, and I've never really worked on it since. But it's quite possible for the government to create money, which is then given to the household sector under condition that those who receive it have to pay their debt down, that those who don't get it, if you don't want to cause additional monetary demand, and at the moment we wouldn't necessarily want to do that, they could be required to buy newly issued corporate shares, which could only be used to pay down the level of corporate debt. So by the government's money creation capacity could be used to drastically reduce the level of private sector debt leverage, and therefore free the private sector of the constraints that their level of debt is currently putting them under, and give you a stimulus out of people being, going back to sort of 1950s or 60s levels of private debt rather than the levels we're carrying now. So that's what I'd prefer to see happen.
Right. But you've got to do that on a global basis, haven't you? Because no country is going to be happy to see the United States, for example, saying, well, we're going to write off all our corporate debt because it's going to place our corporations at a distinct advantage to the rest of the world. Every country will want to say, well, we've got to do the same.
Well, I hope they would. I mean, this is the sort of thing which could actually, by taking the the debt breaks off corporations and households, you could stimulate the economy quite effectively.
But the idea of a jet jubilee, of course, the chances of that are about 1%, perhaps, at best, until we perhaps realise that maybe this thing is going to take a long, long time, and then maybe, in a year's time we might be looking at any opportunity. But if we are to ignore that one for now, what are more practical solutions about how we can ensure that we have a swift recovery from the COVID crisis? To hear more about this, you have to listen to the full version of this podcast, and to do that, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or you can subscribe also at debunkingeconomics.com. That's it for this week. I'm Phil Dobbie with Steve Keen. Back again next week. Thanks for listening.